I was. I did test positive for Hep C along with several STDs.
So now how did that affect your life after that?
Well, unbeknownst to me, I lived for another, I guess, a year or so until the day of my salvation. I came to know the Lord February 2nd, 2003, and basically what brought me to that place was I had been binging on crystal meth for about 4 days, shooting it up, and I had finally come to my body's limitations, and I truly believe God's patience had come to an end as well. At that moment, He took a step back and allowed sin to have its way in my life. And I overdosed. My body began to shut down on day 3 or day 4 of the binging. And as I began to slip away, I began to see and hear things that 12 years of professional drugging, 9 years of professionally drugging had never left me with. Overdose and nearly dying and suicide attempts. You know, I began to clearly see that there was a consequence to sin, spiritually speaking. And, you know, I endured a moment of what I believe was as hell, you know. And it made me such a firm believer that it was a real place that when I came up and came out, my life began to take an immediate change. You know, I mean, we read about the road to Damascus for Paul. And that's exactly what I had. You know, for the first time in my life, I realized that there was a living God and that one day I was going to stand before Him. Now, from that moment forward, you know, because I accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior, not in an attempt to save my life, because I was more than willing to die and to go to hell because I knew that that was the consequence to my sins. But He began to show me that there was life and life more abundantly within Him. And from February 2nd forward, you know, my life, I mean, it was amazing how much of a change took place. Weeks into my salvation is when I actually discovered that there was something going wrong with my body. Because as good as I felt and as great as I felt and as sober as I was at the time, for the first time in years, there was issues. And so shortly thereafter is when we discovered that, you know, there was some issues, sickness and disease and stuff I was dealing with. It's amazing to know how great the love of God is. You know, in spite of everything I had done and in spite of how I felt for so long, God was willing to give me more than just salvation. He gave me a second chance at life. Each time I opened the Bible, each time I read the Scriptures, it would talk about God being the God of healing and God being the God of life and promise, and that He cared, that He sincerely cared for me as an individual. And I was so desperate at that moment and so desperate at that time to be able to meet someone like that, that I was willing to, you know what, take Him up on it. And so when the Bible said that He was those things, I like a child, I leaped in and I blindly grabbed hold and I began to say, you know what, He is these things. And He's going to be these things in my life because I'm going to allow Him to be. I went to several physicians. They sent me to 3 or 4 physicians, including an infectious disease specialist. And each time I went in, I sat down and I began to do the same thing I'm doing with you right here, right now. With fear and trembling, I told him about the goodness of God, everything I had gone through, what I had been delivered from, what God had done for me. And then I furthered it by saying, simply speaking, in spite of what you're telling me has no cure, I still believe in a God that can do the impossible. And so whether He heals me or whether I step into eternity, I'm simply going to praise His name. And at the end of 12 months, after doing those 3 or 4, you know, testimonies, my life changed once again. And long story short, they had to give me documentation that my body had spontaneously cured itself. And so as far as today, 9.5 years later after salvation, you know, I'm healthy. There's no Hep C, there's no STDs. Everything that they said they couldn't fix, God did.
We're going to walk this out.
The fear of God is the beginning of all wisdom. For the first time in my life, I realized that God was real. And, you know, that in itself is enough to empower an individual to make the right decisions at times, if you allow it to be. You know, the first year of my salvation, I fell once sexually. when God began to really reveal what He had in mind for my life, it was more than I could really handle. And it began to make me long for Egypt. And so, the Bible says longing for Egypt will open a door. Well, you know what? The door was open, and I seized the opportunity to run back to the club. But the one thing that I took with me was the fear of God. And so, immediately after walking into the club, I've got a bag of drugs in my hand, and I'm trying to do them, and I'm shivering and shaking. You think I'm overdosing. I haven't done a thing. It was horrible. But I'm grateful that God's mercy allowed me the opportunity to fall and to fail. Now, with that said, I did go home, with a man that night, and I realized almost instantaneously what kind of mistake I had made. For the next 2 weeks, God disciplined me. The spirit that I had felt, His presence, His peace, the love, all that had just come to an end with my decision. Now, it's not that God abandoned me, but He was disciplining me. At the end of the 2 weeks, when, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know if I could have handled it one more day. I was so desperate to get back to where He was. He came back. He allowed His presence once more to fill my life in a way that I said, all right, this is more than worth saying no to that. And from that moment forward, I never was tempted to the extent that I fell victim to it again. Now, I guess with that said, what I'm saying is, coming out of SSA, same-sex attraction, it's not an instantaneous thing at times. For most people, it's not, in my belief. People want a microwave effect, and it's more like a crock pot. Right. You got to sit there long enough to allow God to work on you in such a way that He can begin to build in you something that will stand the test of time. And sometimes it requires failure. Not that God desires you to fail, but simply you got to see that there is a consequence to you not doing what's right. Especially when you serve a God that loves you so much as to discipline you when you do make the wrong decision. My desire to actually have sex with men faded more quickly than what I've heard it faded, I guess, with most. However, my longing to be anyone other than myself is still something I struggle with 9.5 years later. There's still issues that I deal with. So I think that, many times it's different for each individual. But, thank God that He's able to discipline His children and to encourage them and to keep them going. I had come to a place that basically I had decided that I was going to be celibate for the rest of my life. I had no desire whatsoever sexually for a woman. I had no desire sexually for a man either, but I had never been with a woman, There was no reason for me to believe that I would ever be married because of the way I felt. And then here enters Sylvia, an individual that was loving and caring and compassionate, but more importantly, was filled with the Spirit of God and was able to hear. I had made an attempt to put God in a position that He couldn't, reach in my mind. I told Him once when He began to push the issue of one day me being married and having a life and children, maybe, I said, well, Father, if you can find someone that's our age, my age, and has never been with a man, then you know what? We'll talk then. And I thought I had actually gave Him an ultimatum he couldn't meet. And it was just one of those things that on our very first night, me and Sylvia sit down. She'd been raised in the assemblies of God. She was still, an individual that hadn't been with a man. And as soon as she said it, instantly, that conversation from years past came flooding back in, and I thought, oh no. Because I knew what my father was up to. And for the next 2 days, I told her every horrible thing I had ever done, ever thought about doing, ever wanted to do, at that time. I tried everything in the world to run this woman away. But God, God had a plan for my life, and He wasn't going to take no for an answer. So. When I met Sylvia, I did. I used my testimony as a defense tactic because I knew what God was up to. I began to sense it, and I wasn't ready to commit to that. I wasn't ready to face that kind of uncomfortableness when it comes to the female body in a sexual, relationship or intimacy. Only the truth will set us free. We want, at times, to be able to move forward with God without finding the humility that is required. And so when someone asks me the question, should I be honest with the individual that I am possibly going to one day marry? How could you ever question your need to be completely transparent with everything that you've gone through and everything that you've been through? Revelation 12:11 says they overcome by the blood of the Lamb, the word of their testimony, and that they did not shrink back unto death. Self-preservation is, in my opinion, the manifestation of an individual trying to preserve their life. We need to be able to be honest and open with the people that we love. Not everyone's going to be able to accept it, but that's how you're going to know if God is saying whoa or God is saying go, because they sound an awful lot alike. And I think many times we are so, as men or as women that's coming out of SSA, so desperate to move forward that we're being driven by the wrong thing. And so honesty and truth, if that's the one that you're meant to be with, she'll be able to receive, or he'll be able to receive everything that you've ever done and be able to say, you know what, but God. The freedom that I feel now in comparison to what I thought I had back when I was living very actively in the gay lifestyle, is as different as night and day. Even if I had not been living in the homosexual lifestyle, I was still living a life outside of Christ. And so even though I was very much alive, I was really dead. And that only fueled, I believe, the pain and the sorrow and the agony that I was experiencing. Immediately after salvation, for the first time, and as long as I could remember, I wanted to live. And, and that was a statement in itself after everything I had gone through and all the drugs and drinking, and I wanted to live. I was ready to be anything and everything that God could possibly want me to be. I was like a child that had been giving life for the very first time. And so, to everyone that's considering, leaving the homosexual or lesbian lifestyle, to everyone that has ever pondered if change is possible, the one thing that I want to reiterate is, it's well worth it. I don't think I could do it justice to tell you how much wholeness and completion and happiness and hope that I endure daily. And when I say endure, I mean it comes in like a flood. I'm not just saying that. I mean, there has been horrible times that me and my wife have gone through, difficulties financially. I mean, our life has not been perfect since salvation. Our obedience to God came at a very high price. And as much as I have regretted at times doing what was right because of what we got repaid with, I've never really truly regretted ever saying yes to God, because even on the worst day, it's still a better day than any day I ever had in the gay lifestyle. I mean, there is no way to compare the two. I would definitely say that Shanahn Smith is totally free from the sins that one time had ensnared me and just totally enslaved me.